American Vision is putting together a series of books, approximately maybe 30 to 40 books related to the conservative movement, the books that have made the most impact on the conservative movement. I suspect that most Christians have never even heard of these books. Some of them you may be familiar with. This is going to be a fairly long process. We're not going to print these books. We're going to have them scanned and put on CDs and made available to people. And if you'd like to help contribute to this process, you can go to American Vision's site and donate there if you'd like. And doing research for this, we also have an audio series that'll be coming out in 16 30-minute parts on the history of the conservative movement that's done by Gary North. And then we'll do this, there'll be a follow-up with that as well and some other topics related to it. In the process of going through a number of these books, one book that caught my attention that I've been aware of for quite some time that had a decided impact on the conservative movement and still does today in terms of its author. And that is a little book called A Choice, Not an Echo by Phyllis Schlafly that was done in 1964, just prior to the 1964 election with Barry Goldwater and Lyndon Johnson. And as you know, the outcome of that, it seemed very disastrous for the Republicans and the conservative movement of the Republicans, because Goldwater got trounced in that election. The most famous ad in that campaign showed a little girl leaning down and smelling a daisy, and in the background there is an atomic explosion that goes off, giving the impression that if Barry Goldwater ever got into power, that this is what we would be reduced to, that there would be a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. They tried to do the same thing to Ronald Reagan, but by 1980 that no longer worked. Well, Phyllis Schlafly, who had been involved in Republican politics since 1945, she was born in 1924 in the St. Louis area and is still going strong today. She seems never to age. And she has an organization that is extremely influential among conservatives, especially conservative women, Eagle Forum. So she is in the thick of things and has been in the thick of things since the 1940s and has been a Republican stalwart all those years. But at the same time, because we're seeing Republicans today taking on the Republican establishment, and we see that liberals are saying and even so-called moderate Republicans and rhinos, that is Republicans in name only, see this as damaging the party, as fracturing the party. Well, with Schlafly and others with her in the 1960 election between Richard Nixon and JFK, it was Phyllis Schlafly who ended up opposing the Nixon nomination and took a more of a moral plank in the platform. And so we've seen this before, and conservative Christians should not be disillusioned by this. There's nothing wrong with going after either party. If you're a Democrat and see things going on bad in the Democrat Party, you ought to say so, and the same thing with Republicans. And then, of course, she probably gained her greatest fame and put her on the map was going up against the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment was an amendment that was very simply stated. It simply said that there would be no discrimination based upon sex. Well, knowing how lawyers get a hold of these things and special interest groups get a hold of amendments like that, just like they take the general welfare clause out of the Constitution and give us national health care, and yet the general welfare clause, when you look at the specifics of the Constitution, is very clearly defined soon after the phrase is used. And so Schlafly and others thought that this was what would happen to this very plainly stated amendment. Who could oppose equal rights for everybody? 30 of the needed 38 states for ratification had been gotten by the time that Phyllis Schlafly decided to oppose it. And even after an extension, after 7 years, there was 7 years in order to do this, they ended up defeating the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, the forces of feminism and homosexuality, and other gender equality advocates, of course, have gotten a lot of these things through. It's been an arduous task, but they have done it. And therein is the lesson that Phyllis Schlafly, since 1945, has been working doggedly in this area, has never wavered, has continued to build a coalition. And this is just one woman with an organization who has done this. And we see that on the left, we have all types of money and organizational skills. Organizations like ACORN, you have the AARP, you have all these other organizations, and they still are just on the edge of holding back the conservative movement. We need to draw a very good lesson from Phyllis Schlafly of sticking to it, continuing to build a coalition. So I went back to look at A Choice, Not an Echo, and mined a couple of things from it, and reminded me of a scene in The Devil Wears Prada, where Andy, the trained assistant, was coming in there, and she scoffs at the fashion industry, and Meryl Streep, who plays Miranda Priestley, gives her a dressing down on the impact that the design industry has on everybody, whether or not you're involved in it or not. And so there's a section in A Choice, Not an Echo that I think is important. She wrote, from 1936 through 1960, the Republican presidential nominee was selected by a small group of secret kingmakers who are the most powerful opinion makers in the world. They dictated the choice of the Republican presidential nominee just as completely as the Paris dressmakers controlled the length of women's skirts. In the 1940s, when the decree went out from Paris that all women's skirts should be only 14 inches off the floor, every family budget in the United States was unbalanced in a frantic effort to achieve the new look. Each fall, 66 million American women don't spontaneously decide their dresses should be an inch or two shorter or longer than last year. Like sheep, they bow to the wishes of a select clique of courtiers whom they have never seen and whose names they may never even know. It is easy to predict that when skirts get about as short as they can possibly go, a Paris edict will be handed down again, and otherwise sensible American women, even when they cannot afford such extravagance, will throw or give away perfectly good dresses in order to buy new ones which will meet the fashion dictates of a half-dozen dressmakers in Paris. In the same way, a few secret kingmakers based in New York selected every Republican presidential nominee from 1936 through 1960 and successfully forced their choice on a free country where there are more than 35 million Republican voters. Now, we began to see that broke in 1964, and what looked like an extremely bad defeat with Barry Goldwater, but conservatives stayed with it. In 1980, we saw Ronald Reagan nominated, which went against, at least initially, the kingmakers. Now we're beginning to see a similar type thing happening. The kingmakers are being exposed. They no longer have control over the gates of power. The social networking, the internet, television, kind of renegade candidates. We have Fox News. We have talk radio. A great deal has changed since Phyllis Schlafly wrote A Choice, Not an Echo in 1964. And we should be first encouraged by these efforts. Second, we should really be appreciative of someone like Phyllis Schlafly, who has stayed with it since 1945 and has given us a lesson in persistence. And thirdly, we should put confidence in God's work that He can bring about change if Christians would once again be involved in the political process.